Hey guys, tonight we are going to uncover a story of immense tragedy and fierce heroism about a woman who was destined to be a pawn, yet became the architect of England's most powerful dynasty. She was only 6 when she first married, and at the age of 12, she was forced to wed a man twice her age, only to be widowed within a single year. Furthermore, when she was just 13, she gave birth to a child, and that very childbirth nearly cost her own life. This is not some fictional plot from a grand historical epic. This is the true life of Margaret Beaufort. She was ripped from her only child for 14 long years and faced execution for treason. But Margaret never broke. She secretly plotted, she patiently waited, and in the end, she won. However, that glory came with an incredibly high price. Her final days were filled with pain and deep regret. She fought for her son her entire life, and when death finally took him, her own will to survive ran out. 2 months later, her broken heart gave up. This is a true story of pain, courage, and ruthless ambition. Where kings fell, children died. But the love of a mother forever changed the destiny of a nation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are following this story from and what your local time is right now. Please leave a comment below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Margaret Beaufort was born on the 31st of May, 1443, the only surviving daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. From the moment she entered the world, her life was arranged between silk and sorrow. When Margaret turned 1, her father, John Beaufort, died in a state of despair. Some historians believe he was defeated in battle, losing both reputation and fortune, and felt such humiliation that he sought death as an escape. From that point on, little Margaret, though still innocent, became a priceless asset in the eyes of the English nobility. For she had inherited vast estates, thousands of acres of farmland, sprawling manors, and a treasury overflowing with gold and silver. Margaret's guardianship immediately became the subject of fierce contests between powerful factions. The first victor was William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, a trusted royal favourite. He swiftly took Margaret into his household as a ward, intending to control her inheritance and augment his own power by arranging her marriage. When she was just 6, the Earl of Suffolk coerced her into marriage with his son John de la Pole, who was then 7 years old. This marriage bore none of the ceremonious trappings of adulthood. Margaret and John lived apart, did not share the bridal chamber, and the union existed solely on paper to legitimize Suffolk's control of her assets. 3 years passed. At 9, Margaret's betrothal was annulled by decree, as if the marriage had never occurred. Yet the bitter lesson remained engraved in her young mind. She was merely a pawn moved by powerful men on the political chessboard. The next upheaval came in 1450, when Suffolk was assassinated by disaffected nobles who resented his overreach. Once again, Margaret's wardship became a prize to be seized. By 1453, Edmund and Jasper Tudor half-brothers, born out of wedlock to King Henry VI and his French queen, Catherine de Valois, secured custody of Margaret. Both Edmund and Jasper bore royal blood, yet entered the world under scandalous circumstances. After King Henry V's death, Catherine secretly wed Owen Tudor, a Welsh soldier, and their children were born in secrecy, illegitimate in the eyes of church and state. Despite their royal lineage, they began life amid whispers and subterfuge. Margaret, now 12, stood at the threshold between childhood and adolescence, while Edmund Tudor was well into middle age, more than 20 years her senior. Political advisors wasted no time. They arranged Edmund as Margaret's second husband. This was not a marriage of affection, but a ritual to bind the Tudor claim more tightly. Edmund, eager to secure his heirs, concealed no ambition to produce offspring immediately, even though his young bride remained barely into her teens. Upon Margaret's 12th birthday, as Edmund reached his prime, the marriage on parchment subtly transformed into reality. Margaret left her native Oxfordshire for Wales, settling with Edmund in Lampy, Pembrokeshire, a remote land shrouded in mist, where drifting clouds and whispered breezes set a dreamlike scene. There, in quiet isolation, Edmund pursued his desire to bear Tudor heirs at any cost. But fate tests mortals with sudden turns. A year later, the darkness of the Wars of the Roses, a bloody struggle for the English crown between Lancaster and York engulfed the realm. Edmund was captured in battle and died on the 1st of November, 1456, in Carmarthen Castle's dank prison, succumbing to the plague. The whirlwind marriage of Margaret and Edmund Tudor thus ended in shocking tragedy. A widowed girl of 13, still with child, bereft of a husband to share joy or pain. Thus closes the first chapter of Margaret Beaufort's early life. From a motherless infant buried in luxury and grief, to a child forced into the merciless currents of power. Each step, though taken in youth, bore the weight of ambition and peril, even as her young heart quietly yearned for love and peace. Margaret was still little more than a child, not nearly old enough to grasp the full consequences of the marriage that had been arranged for her. It was at the end of April 1456 that she discovered she was with child and unborn life, forming within a body not yet fully grown. Her husband, Edmund Tudor, had been captured by enemy forces only months earlier. He never learned of her condition, for he succumbed to the plague in Carmarthen Castle on the 1st of November 1456, dying in prison before the birth of his own son. In the eyes of the world, Margaret Beaufort was then a widow at the age of 12, left alone and far from home in the damp chill of Pembrokeshire. For the months that followed, Jasper Tudor Edmund's younger brother took Margaret under his protection at Pembroke Castle. Though Jasper provided shelter and care, no earthly fortress could shield her from the ordeal that awaited. On the 28th of January 1457, Margaret, now 13 years old, was thrust into labour. The agony of that delivery became the stuff of whispered legend, hours, perhaps even days, of unrelenting pain, with no anaesthetic to dull her screams, and no real understanding of complications. Medieval midwives and barbers knew nothing of modern medicine, and when the birth stalled, there was no recourse but endurance. Margaret cried out in terror, her small frame battered by contractions, losing blood until those around her feared she would perish on the birthing stool. Historians Elizabeth Norton, Linda Porter, and Leander de Lisle each note that Margaret barely survived that night. Some even say she was lucky simply to draw another breath. When at last the infant cried, a son named Henry, the tiny prince was a fragile slip of life, barely 3 pounds by modern estimate, wrapped in linen and tender's prayers. Margaret's own life hung by a thread. The violence of the birth, the blood loss, and the overwhelming shock left her body so damaged that she would never bear another child. Yet, in that moment of triumph, she gained her single most precious possession, the Tudor heir, for whom she would devote every ounce of strength. Margaret's recovery in the weeks thereafter was slow and uncertain. She lay confined to her chamber in Pembroke Castle as Jasper Tudor overseer her convalescence, offering what comfort he could summon. Her nights were long with fever and delirium, her days pale and blurred, but through it all, the cry of her newborn son was a constant lullaby, binding her to a fate she had not chosen, but would relentlessly pursue. That infant Henry would become the key to her own survival and to the rise of the dynasty that bore their name. The Wars of the Roses broke out as two rival branches of the Plantagenet family tore England apart. Lancaster, whose badge was the red rose, and York, whose badge was the white rose. The Tudor line, steadfastly Lancastrian, suddenly found itself imperilled when, in 1461, Edward IV claimed the throne. With Edward IV's coronation, Margaret Beaufort's precarious position worsened. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, the son of the Duke of Buckingham, whom she had married for alliance rather than affection, stood beside her. But even his status could not shield their household fully. Many Lancastrian nobles faced execution or forfeiture of lands. And though Edward IV showed mercy by allowing Margaret and Stafford to retain their estates, he seized the couple's only child, 4-year-old Henry Tudor. Forced from his mother's arms, the boy was handed to William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke's ally, and a devout Yorkist commander, to be raised expressly as York's ward. This meant that the child's upbringing, education, and very identity now served York's interests, an unforgivable twist for Margaret, who saw in her son the fragile hope of her lineage. In the weeks that followed, Herbert's castle became Henry's new home, and Margaret's visits were tightly controlled. She was permitted only rare, formal audiences, each conducted under watchful Yorkist eyes. Yet Margaret refused to relinquish her son to fate. From her corner of England, She wrote secret letters, her handwriting small and precise, carried by trusted messengers through hidden routes to Pembroke. Each message conveyed careful counsel, instructions on chapel attendance, remarks on his health, even veiled suggestions that he must never accept York's full trust. These clandestine missives were her lone means of shaping her child's future, though they placed his custodians at risk should any note be unmasked. In 1469, during the heights of the unrest, conflict flared again. William Herbert was compelled by King Edward's counsel to lead the army into battle, and he took 12-year-old Henry Tudor along as a symbol of Lancastrian subjugation. The Yorkists suffered defeat, and in the chaos, Herbert fell in combat. Witnesses reported that Margaret, upon hearing news of Herbert's demise, feared her son lay slain beside the corpse of his captor. For days she awaited word, each moment heavy with dread. At last, news arrived. Henry lived on. He had been rescued by Anne Devereux, Herbert's widow, who defied Yorkist command by ensuring his safety. In her humble household, young Henry recovered, though still under the wary eyes of York's authorities. Margaret's relief was profound, yet she understood that her son remained a political pawn. His Lancastrian lineage marked him as heir to the Red Rose cause, and the Yorkists viewed him with equal parts scorn and suspicion. Throughout these perilous years, Margaret's resolve never wavered. She manoeuvred within the narrow confines allowed her, attending court functions when summoned, yet always with her mind fixed on her son's welfare. Every smile she offered to Yorkist courtiers concealed a mother's sorrow. Every courtesy token was a testament to her survival instincts. Though she could not openly rebel, she refused to submit wholly, her loyalty quietly pledged to the Lancastrian emblem. Thus, as the competition between red and white roses raged across the countryside fields stained red with battle and hearts heavy with loss, Margaret Beaufort remained anchored by her maternal devotion. Even when England's earldoms shifted their allegiances, and kings rose and fell like the tides, her belief in Henry Tudor's destiny endured. In the quiet of her chambers, she laid plans not for herself but for the boy she called my son, whose blood bound him to a crushed house, yet whose future she vowed to reclaim. In 1470, the balance of power shifted once more. A sudden Lancastrian resurgence restored King Henry VI to the throne, and Margaret Beaufort found herself summoned back to the royal court. After years of separation and clandestine correspondence, she stood in London's grand halls, her heart fluttering at the promise of reunion with her only son. Henry Tudor, now 14 years old, had grown from the fragile infant Margaret barely held in regard into a young man on the cusp of manhood. Their reunion, when she first saw him at Whitehall Palace, was described by contemporaries as a moment of pure wonder. Margaret, so long bereft, embracing the son she had not held since his infancy. Henry VI himself, his hair streaked with grey and his mind clouded by bouts of mental despondency, gazed upon the boy and murmured, "This child will one day wear the crown." But the joy that swept through Margaret's heart proved fleeting. In March of 1471, Edward IV returned from exile with renewed vigour. His Yorkist forces struck at the Lancastrian army on the fields of Tewkesbury, crushing all opposition. King Henry VI was seized, imprisoned, and ultimately murdered in the Tower of London. His only surviving son, Edward of Lancaster, barely 17 years old, was hunted down, tortured, and killed on the battlefield. The Lancastrian cause lay in tatters. The Red Rose banner was trampled into the mud, and Henry Tudor, at age 14, transformed overnight from royal heir to fugitive. The boy who had once been paraded through Pembroke Castle as a captive was now forced to flee from the man who had crowned him. Margaret, sensing the imminent danger, sent word in haste for her son to escape across the Channel to France. In late April 1471, Henry and his uncle, Jasper Tudor, set sail under the cover of darkness. Their voyage, however, was fraught with peril. Storm winds blew them off course, and their ship drifted southward along the coast of Brittany rather than landing in Normandy as planned. When finally they made landfall, it was on Breton shores, not French, in a semi-independent duchy ruled by Duke Francis II. There, in that mist-shrouded land of stone ramparts and moss-covered forests, young Henry found refuge under the Duke's protection. For 14 long years, Brittany became his home, a place of study and quiet preparation for a destiny yet unfulfilled. Back in England, Margaret Beaufort remained behind, her presence at court reduced to a whisper of respect and suspicion. She moved through Tudor house with unchanging composure, attending state ceremonies when allowed, yet each time her mind flitted back to her son's safety. She placed her faith in the Duke of Brittany's promise of asylum, knowing that while Henry lived, so too lived the hope of her house. During these years of enforced separation, Margaret's resolve only strengthened. She cultivated alliances among disaffected Yorkists and loyal Lancastrians who lingered in England's shadows, sending messages whenever couriers could slip through the coast's blockades. Her letters, written in careful cipher, spoke of patience and vigilance. "Let no promise of courtesy fool you," she advised Henry, "for the crown you seek lies wrapped in thorn and shadow." In Brittany, Henry Tudor matured under tutors who taught him French, Latin, and the ways of knighthood. Yet his heart remained anchored to the land of his birth and to the mother who had given him life. One moonlit night in Saint-Paul-de-Léon, he penned a letter in his own hand to Margaret. "I dream of England's green fields. I await the day I may return." Margaret treasured this missive, carrying it hidden beneath the folds of her court gown, feeling its weight as both promise and burden. So passed the years. Henry sheltered in Brittany, growing into a thoughtful youth of 18, and Margaret enduring in England, a silent figure woven into court life, but ever watchful of the tides of power. Though they were separated by the sea and by armies, their wills remained intertwined. In a land torn by rose-stained bloodshed, a mother's love and a son's faith became the quiet forces that would one day topple kings and crown a new dynasty. In the year 1472, tragedy struck Margaret Beaufort's life once more when her second husband, Henry Stafford, succumbed to wounds sustained in earlier battles. Despite looming grief, she refused to bow beneath sorrow's weight. Almost as soon as Margaret's mourning period concluded, she entered into her third marriage, this time with Thomas, Lord Stanley, a prominent noble closely aligned with King Edward IV. Unlike her previous unions, this marriage was neither born of youthful coercion nor romantic affection. Rather, it was a deliberate, calculated step toward embedding herself within the very heart of Yorkist power. By allying with Lord Stanley, whose loyalty to Edward IV was well recognised, Margaret secured a foothold in the royal court that could serve both her safety and her son's future. Although Stanley's relationship with Edward IV placed him under close scrutiny, he also enjoyed considerable autonomy in the northwestern marches of England, where his estates spanned Lancashire and Cheshire. Margaret's new status meant she shared her husband's responsibilities. Lord Stanley was frequently entrusted with maintaining order along the Welsh border, presiding over local courts, and serving as a member of the King's Council when summoned. Margaret accompanied him on ceremonial duties. Together they greeted foreign ambassadors, attended banquets in Chester, and witnessed the proclamation of new statutes in London's Guildhall. Yet behind her gracious smiles and embroidered court gowns, Margaret's mind never strayed far from her exiled son in Brittany. Through Stanley's position, Margaret gained access to critical intelligence. Courtiers, soldiers and messengers alike crossed the Stanley's threshold, bringing tales of shifting loyalties, rumours of upheaval, and glimpses of Edward IV's mood. From these fragments, Margaret pieced together a picture of the political landscape. At opportune moments when Lord Stanley journeyed to court or dined with high-ranking Yorkist officials, Margaret slipped secret letters into his leather pouch. In careful cipher, she advised Henry Tudor never to trust the promises of Edward's successors, for the crown you claim is enmeshed in blood and false vows. While Margaret strengthened that silent network, she also began weaving another alliance, this one with Elizabeth Woodville, the former queen stripped of her title when Edward IV married her in 1465. Though Elizabeth Woodville's own fortunes had fallen after Henry VI's brief restoration, she retained considerable influence among Yorkist supporters who resented Richard, Duke of Gloucester's manoeuvres. Recognising a shared interest, Margaret initiated discreet correspondence with Elizabeth. Their letters, penned on fine vellum and sealed with personal signets, expressed mutual sympathy over losses endured, but also hinted at a plan that could unite Lancaster and York. "When Henry demands his birthright, may our lines entwine and bloom anew," Margaret wrote, her pen gliding across each parchment with both hope and caution. To the outside world, Margaret Beaufort remained the dutiful wife of Lord Stanley, a woman of piety and benevolence, known for charitable donations to local churches in Lancashire, and for providing dowries to girls of gentle birth. She sponsored poor scholars, tended to the sick in the Stanley household, and attended Easter Communion at Whalley Abbey in sombre devotion. No courtier could have suspected that behind such acts lay the patient laying of groundwork for her son's future return. Margaret's finesse lay in never revealing too much, yet always positioning herself to receive invaluable insight. When Edward IV suddenly died on the 9th of April 1483, Stanley's loyalty was tested. Rumours swirled that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, intended to seize power indeed. Richard moved swiftly to arrest Edward's brother Clarence and to detain the two young princes. Margaret, forewarned by her network, sensed the imminent danger. She counselled Stanley to publicly declare loyalty to the new regime, while privately assuring him that any overreach by Richard would have consequences. Throughout the spring and summer of 1483, Margaret continued to attend court functions, her voice soft and her demeanour compliant. Yet she kept a book of Elizabeth Woodville's letters tucked beneath her prayer book, and she pressed Lord Stanley to retain channels open to Brittany. Each time Stanley rode north to quell a border skirmish or journeyed to London to sit on the King's Council, he carried another secret missive for Henry Tudor: maps of safe landing sites, names of sympathetic gentry ready to rally to the Red Rose, and coded encouragements to bide his time until England's heart turned back to his cause. By marrying Lord Stanley, Margaret Beaufort had woven herself into Yorkist fabric. By forging ties with Elizabeth Woodville, she had built a bridge between past and future claimants. Her actions, quiet, deliberate, and unfailingly strategic, showed a level of political acumen unmatched by most men at court. Though her outward appearance remained that of a serene and loyal noblewoman, inwardly Margaret plotted an intricate path for her son, readying the stage on which he would someday stride forth, claim his crown, and reshape the destiny of England. In 1483, England's fragile balance of power shattered in a single moment. On the 9th of April, King Edward IV suddenly died at the age of 40, leaving behind his eldest son, Edward V, just 12 years old. Into this vacuum stepped Richard, Duke of Gloucester Edward, V's own maternal uncle who had been entrusted with the boy king's protection. Yet Richard wasted no time transforming guardianship into usurpation. Within days he arrested Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, confining them to the Tower of London, and declaring that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. By this decree, the princes were illegitimate and stripped of their rights. On the 6th of July, 1483, Richard proclaimed himself King Richard III, sending shockwaves through the realm. Margaret Beaufort, ever watchful from her position at court, recognised immediately the grim potential of Richard's ambition. Rumours spread like wildfire through London's corridors that the two young princes would vanish within the tower's grim walls. Yet Margaret, no stranger to intrigue, refused to accuse herself falsely. She understood that only Richard had both motive and means to eliminate his nephews. Only he wielded immediate custody and the royal prerogative to seal the prince's fate. Whispered gossip hinted at midnight visits, locked doors, and silent corridors stained with treachery. The so-called princes in the Tower became the most talked-about mystery of the age, their disappearance a wound on England's conscience. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to cultivate alliances among disaffected nobles who harboured resentment toward Richard's swift power grab. Among them was Elizabeth Woodville, Richard III's own mother-in-law, and the dethroned queen whose 5 daughters had been mutilated by the annulment decree. Elizabeth, embittered by loss of title and influence, saw in Margaret a fellow mother wronged by Richard's coup. Under the guise of social calls and charitable gatherings, the two women exchanged discreet messages. In hushed tones they crafted a daring pact. That young Henry Tudor, Margaret's son, 14 years old now and still in exile, would marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. Such a union would bridge Red Rose and White Rose bloodlines, symbolically healing the rift between Lancaster and York. To many, the idea seemed fanciful. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was feeble at best, deriving from a legitimised but barred lineage, and he remained geographically distant on Breton soil. Yet Margaret and Elizabeth recognised its strategic brilliance. A Tudor-York marriage would legitimise Henry's cause and rally both Lancastrian loyalists and Yorkist malcontents under a single banner. Over the summer of 1483, couriers rode the length of England and across the Channel to Brittany, carrying messages bound in coded verse. They spoke of roses merging at dawn, crown reforged in unity, and a new era born of maternal bonds. Each letter passed censorship only by feigning religious content or family news. Back at court, Richard III grew suspicious of any gathering of noble women. Rumours reached his ear that Margaret and Elizabeth met frequently in the gardens of Westminster Abbey, their voices low and anxious. Yet he could not act openly against either without peril. Margaret's marriage to Lord Stanley had protected her from direct reprisal. Stanley remained Richard's staunch ally, valued for his military prowess in the Welsh marches. Elizabeth Woodville, despite her dethronement, still commanded the sympathy of many Yorkist ladies who recalled her as queen. Thus, Richard found himself constrained, unable to dissolve the clandestine alliance without risking open revolt among powerful families. Meanwhile, Margaret Beaufort maintained her outward composure. She continued to attend Richard's court with measured grace, supporting public celebrations and offering prayers for the new king's health. Yet beneath her serene smile lay the coiled energy of a strategist at work. She planted seeds of rumour that Henry Tudor's cause was divinely sanctioned, citing the prophecy Henry VI had uttered years before. Those who listened heard faint echoes of a future king whose legitimacy transcended parliamentary decrees. By the autumn of 1483, the rebellion's framework stood ready. A coalition of Lancastrians, Yorkist exiles, and disenchanted courtiers agreed to rise in support of Henry Tudor's claim. Margaret, at the heart of the conspiracy, had orchestrated every detail: landing sites along the Welsh coast, sympathisers in border towns, and contingency plans should Richard uncover their plot. Elizabeth Woodville's daughters were promised dowries. English mercenaries were enticed by Tudor gold. Even some of Richard's own commanders were rumoured to waver in their loyalties. Thus, as the year waned toward winter, England held its breath. The silent pact between two noble mothers, Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville, set the stage for one of the most daring uprisings in English history. In the dim candlelight of secret chambers, their voices joined in quiet resolve that Henry Tudor would return, would claim what was rightfully his, and would unite roses once torn asunder. The wheel of fortune turned, and the game of crowns would soon reach a momentous turning point. In the autumn of 1483, the carefully woven alliance between Lancaster and the Woodville faction reached its tipping point. Under Margaret Beaufort's subtle encouragement and promises of high rank in a Tudor-led realm, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, once Richard III's most trusted lieutenant, rose in revolt. Buckingham's rebellion was intended as the spark that would ignite Lancastrian and Yorkist dissent alike, paving the way for young Henry Tudor's return. The insurrection was scheduled for early November, with coordinated uprisings set to break out simultaneously in Wales, Herefordshire, and parts of London. Margaret, cloaked in the guise of a loyal courtier, passed her final instructions in hushed tones to William Stanley, her husband Thomas Stanley's brother, entrusting him with the dispatch of secret letters. These letters, folded into small leather pouches, urged Buckingham to press on and assured him of support from both the disaffected nobility and exiled Lancastrians abroad. Margaret's vow rang clear: "When Henry claims his crown, your name shall be among the first honoured in the new court." Yet the plan misfired. Buckingham, eager and impatient, struck prematurely on the 2nd of November, 1483, before many contingents had rallied to his banner. His force, estimated at under 2,000 men, was no match for the king's royal army. Buckingham was captured within days, tried, and beheaded on the 6th of November at Salisbury, a swift and brutal end that sent shockwaves of terror through the conspirators. Richard III, ever vigilant to threats against his throne, now held the cards to crush any further resistance. Margaret Beaufort might have been swept away in the purge. Instead, her strategic marriage to Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley by his title, shielded her from immediate ruin. Stanley, in his capacity as Lord Chamberlain and a key commander in the king's service, wielded enough influence that Richard dared not execute or imprison Margaret outright. Rather, the king retaliated by seizing her vast estates. Thousands of acres in Lancashire, Cheshire and the Welsh marches were confiscated and redistributed among loyal Yorkist nobles. Margaret was placed under house arrest at one of the Stanley manors, her movements strictly limited and her correspondence monitored by Stanley's own guards. Despite this enforced isolation and the loss of her fortune, Margaret's resolve remained unbroken. From her seclusion, she maintained her clandestine network, sending and receiving coded messages through trusted servitors, ladies-in-waiting, courier boys, and disguised yeoman riders. Each missive bore the same urgent refrain: warnings to Henry not to trust any summons from Richard, instructions on covert meeting places along the Breton coast, and maps marking safe harbours, where loyalists stood ready to escort him to shore. Margaret even secured the loyalty of Lady Anne Devereux, widow of the fallen William Herbert, who agreed to relay her mother's counsel to Brittany's court and help direct funds for Henry's upkeep. Margaret's secret correspondence was a testament to her political acumen. She wrote of roses waiting to bloom, of crowns cast in waiting, and cautioned her son to observe the silence of the court, for the whisper can speak more truth than the shout. Each letter was stamped with a small Tudor mermaid device, and hidden behind religious tracts or sewn into the hems of skirts. Although under Richard's formal house arrest, Margaret's mind roamed freely across the Channel, ever watchful for the moment when Henry would sail again for England's shores. Meanwhile, in Brittany, Henry Tudor pored over these letters by candlelight, piecing together his mother's strategy. He read her warnings of betrayal and lists of sympathisers in southwest England. When Lord Stanley's name surfaced, often cited as the Stony Back, Henry knew his mother's plans hinged on the Stanley family's ultimate choice. Margaret's faith in Stanley's loyalty was not misplaced. Time and again she reminded him that the Stanley coat of arms bore not only York's white rose but also the red rose of Lancaster, symbolising their precarious position between two realms. Through the bleak winter of 1483, Margaret endured her confinement with quiet dignity. She continued to attend daily prayers, donated alms to the poor in Cheshire, and maintained an air of pious compliance. Yet each night she knelt at her bedside, not only in devotion but in silent vigil, her heart tethered to the distant Brittany coast and the son for whom she had sacrificed all. Thus, while Richard III believed he had quelled the Tudor threat by extinguishing Buckingham's rebellion, Margaret Beaufort's secret defiance endured her network intact, her purpose unwavering, and her son's return still envisioned against the winds of exile. The wheel of fortune, though temporarily stalled, was far from at rest, and the seeds of rebellion she had sown lay waiting for the sunlit day when they would at last bloom in triumph. By 1485, King Richard III's grip on England had begun to slip. His queen, Anne Neville, had died on the 16th of March, 1485, leaving him without an heir to secure his dynasty. Whispers in court spoke of Richard's restless nights and clouded brow, for a king without progeny stood vulnerable. In this moment of royal uncertainty, Margaret Beaufort recognised her last opportunity to dispatch her son, Henry Tudor, across the Channel and into England's very heart. On the 7th of August, 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in southwest Wales, accompanied by perhaps 2,000 loyal soldiers. The sky was overcast, and sea mists curled about the rocky shoreline as his ships cast anchor. Henry himself, now 19 years old, stepped onto English soil with a mixture of reverence and resolve. The Welsh coast, long the seat of his family's exile, bore witness to his return not as a forlorn claimant, but as a challenger to Richard's fraying authority. As Henry's small force advanced northward through Pembrokeshire and Cardiganshire, he sent messages to key local magnates, urging them to rally to his banner. Among those swooning loyalties were members of the Stanley family: Thomas Stanley, Margaret Beaufort's husband, and his younger brother William Stanley. Both men held significant power in the Welsh marches and throughout northwest England, yet they remained hesitant, bound by oath to Richard III and wary of taking the wrong side. Across the waters, Margaret Beaufort, confined yet undeterred, directed a campaign of persuasion. Through secret letters and discreet emissaries, she reminded Lord Stanley of his debts. The marriage to herself had bound his lineage to the Tudor cause, and his daughter's futures lay entwined with Henry's success. In her carefully crafted missives, Margaret invoked themes of honour and ambition, writing of glory awaiting the father of a king, and of the honour that shines upon the branch that bends low to lift the rose. Each line played upon Stanley's pride, assuring him that his legacy would endure if he acted now. Margaret's network of couriers remained her eyes and ears in England. They reported back gossip from the market squares, the allegiances of local sheriffs, and the mood in garrisons posted along Henry's route. When word reached Margaret that Richard had marched north to intercept Henry, she seized the moment, dispatching a final cable of encouragement to Stanley. The sun sets on Richard's cause. Seize the dawn and stand with Henry. Let not fear silence your bloodline's promise. Thomas Stanley, a man of caution, cautious as the tides in the Irish Sea, found himself beset by conflicting loyalties. He owed fealty to the king who had appointed him Earl of Derby, yet he could not ignore the woman whose lineage brought him both wealth and standing. And though William Stanley served abroad under Yorkist command, his heart remained tethered to his sister-in-law's cause. Through the summer days, the brothers exchanged letters with Margaret, each denying openly that they would abandon Richard, yet each secretly acknowledging her sway. On a damp August evening, with the wind sighing through the trees of the Forest of Dean, Thomas Stanley received word at Chepstow Castle that Henry's army was within 70 miles of Gloucester. The decisive moment loomed. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. By aiding Henry, you become more than a noble. You become the father of a king. He pondered her promise of lands and titles that would elevate the Stanley name forever. He recalled the tears Margaret shed when Henry first fled, as a boy tears of a mother who refused to surrender hope. As Richard approached with a host of perhaps 10,000 men, Stanley privately weighed his options. Should he betray his sovereign to back an exiled claimant? Or risk handing victory to a king who had already shown himself both secure and ruthless? The answer lay in the letters Margaret continued to send, notes full of guarantee that the tide was turning, that Henry's landing had inspired Lancaster sympathisers everywhere, that Yorkist morale wavered. By the 18th of August, Richard's forces camped near the town of Cirencester, waiting for word of Stanley's allegiance. Henry, meanwhile, pressed on toward Shrewsbury, gathering support as he marched. The day before dawn's first light, Lord Stanley wrote a final ciphered reply to Margaret, entrusting a messenger with the promise that he would act when the battle's tide turned. This assurance, born of Margaret's tireless persuasion and deft handling of loyalties, ensured that Stanley and William would both hold their ground, poised to tip the scales at the moment that most mattered. Thus, as the moon rose on the 21st of August, King Richard III faced his foe on Bosworth Field, uncertain of his own army's cohesion. In the hush before battle, Margaret Beaufort's strategy reached its climax. The power of a mother's promise and a wife's counsel would soon decide whether her son would rise to claim the crown, or vanish once more into the mists of history. On the 22nd day of August, 1485, two armies met on the gentle slopes of Bosworth Field in Leicestershire, under a sky veiled by early morning mist. One army bore the red Tudor banner, and was commanded by 19-year-old Henry Tudor. The opposing force, numbered perhaps 8,000 strong, flew the White Rose of York under King Richard III. Richard, confident in his heavy cavalry and the loyalty of his noble followers, arrayed his knights in dense squadrons, hoping to crush the usurping Lancastrian threat in a single decisive charge. As dawn's first light glinted on polished armour and steel-tipped lances, Richard spurred his steed forward, spear in hand, cutting through the ranks of Henry's men with ferocious might. Witnesses later described his attack as sudden and daring. He charged not at the enemy block but straight toward the heart of Henry's position, aiming to kill the boy claimant and end the rebellion in one stroke. Screams of horses and men echoed across the dew-soaked field as the Yorkist king thundered onward, his scarlet cloak billowing like a flame against the grey morning. Yet the tide of battle turned on an unexpected flank. Standing watch on the edge of the field were Thomas Stanley and his younger brother William, each with his own 100 knights, poised under orders from Margaret Beaufort, but biding their moment. They had promised the king fealty, yet answered Margaret's plea to await the crucial sign. When Richard, in full view of his array, plunged toward Henry Tudor's modest pavilion, Stanley sent his men thundering down the gentle rise from Redamore Hill to strike the Yorkist right flank. The sudden appearance of Stanley's horsemen sowed confusion among Richard's ranks. Shields rattled, banners fluttered in disarray, and the disciplined lines of Yorkist knights wavered under the unexpected assault. Richard, still locked in pursuit of Henry, found himself surrounded by adversaries both before and behind. In this instant, the king's gamble unravelled. His personal guard was thinned, his cavalry thrown into disarray, and his infantry left vulnerable. Richard fought on, his sword flashing in the morning sun as he cleaved through soldiers loyal to Stanley. But the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Gathering his courage, Henry Tudor rallied his men and pressed forward alongside Stanley's charge. Together, their combined forces engulfed Richard's weary troops. In the swirl of steel and sweat, King Richard III fell from his horse, struck down by a lance to the chest, according to chroniclers. Some accounts claim he died bravely on the field, his gauntlet still clenched around his sword's hilt, while others suggest he lay unmoving, his heavy spurs the last link to chivalric demise. Within minutes, the king was dead, and the battle effectively won. William Stanley dismounted, walked through the throng of bodies, and retrieved the fallen crown of England. In a gesture charged with both symbolism and destiny, he placed the crown upon Henry Tudor's head. The cheers that rose across Bosworth Field echoed like thunder. The red rose of Lancaster, newly entwined with Stanley's white, promised an end to decades of civil war and the dawn of a fresh dynasty. Far from the carnage, Margaret Beaufort received word of the victory in her London lodgings. As messenger after messenger arrived, some breathless from long rides, others bearing Richard's broken battle belt, Margaret allowed herself a rare, gentle smile. Though she had not stood on Bosworth Field, her presence loomed large over its outcome. Every covert letter she penned, every alliance she forged, and every careful encouragement she gave to the Stanleys had culminated in this moment. In the days that followed, Henry Tudor was formally crowned King Henry VII at Westminster Abbey on the 30th of October, 1485. By then, Margaret, now My Lady the King's mother, had arranged a grand procession through London streets, her own pace measured, her robe of black damask trimmed with fine lace. The people cheered for the new king, his mother standing at his side, her eyes soft with triumph and relief. Thus ended the Wars of the Roses, not with a king in velvet court, but with a conquering claimant crowned in a swirl of mist and steel. Margaret Beaufort, the architect of a quiet rebellion, had guided her son's path from exile to empire. Her abiding patience, political shrewdness, and an unyielding mother's love proved greater than lance or law, forging a Tudor throne that would reign over England for a century to come. After Henry VII ascended the throne on the 30th of October, 1485, Margaret Beaufort assumed the distinguished title of Mother of the King, the highest rank accorded to any woman in the realm. It was a status she bore with quiet dignity, signing her correspondence with the regal monogram Margaret R., as though she were a reigning queen in her own right. Yet while her son wore the crown, Margaret wielded soft power throughout his reign, guiding the young king and shaping the Tudor legacy. Over the next 24 years, Margaret devoted herself to public works and educational patronage. In the year 1505, she founded Christ's College at Cambridge. The charter, granted on the 12th of July, laid out plans for a chapel, a master's house, and accommodations for scholarships. Later, through the provisions of her will and the actions of her executors after her death, John's College was established on the 9th of April, 1511, though Margaret did not live to see its completion. Both colleges became havens for scholars of theology, law, and classical learning, fulfilling Margaret's vision of advancing piety and learning among future generations. Margaret also supported the nascent English printing press. She commissioned translations of the Bible into English lines, ensuring that the word could be read by merchants and commoners alike, a radical departure from the exclusive Latin texts of earlier eras. By the early months of 1508, dozens of volumes bearing her coat of arms in the colophon had circulated in Oxford, Cambridge, and London, ushering in an age when literacy began to spread beyond cathedral schools. Her legislative influence extended to property rights as well. Concerned that the Tudor line remained secure, Margaret worked with Privy Council advisers to reform the laws of inheritance. In 1502, Parliament passed an act limiting the power of escheators to seize lands of those attainted of treason, thereby mitigating the risk that political conspiracies could deprive loyal subjects and their heirs of rightful estates. These legal safeguards protected not only her family's holdings but also set precedents for property rights that endured in English common law. Margaret's public persona was immortalized in her 6-foot-tall portrait by the Italian sculptor Pietro Torregiano, completed around 1508. In it, she stands clad in black, her widow's veil framing a serene, contemplative face. Her hands are clasped at her waist, a rosary draped between her fingers, while her stark gaze conveys both devotion and authority. The portrait hung in her chambers at court, inspiring visitors with its blend of maternal warmth and regal bearing. Yet amid these triumphs, Margaret's deepest joy lay in the well-being of her son. That joy turned to sorrow on the 21st of April, 1509, when Henry VII died at Richmond Palace at the age of 52. Accounts describe Margaret rushing to his bedside, cradling his hand as he breathed his last. For a mother who had survived widowhood at 13 and endured decades of exile and intrigue, the loss of her only child was a blow beyond measure. In her final letters, she wrote of her heart rent asunder and of the emptiness that now filled her life. Barely 2 months later, Margaret succumbed to illness. According to contemporary rumour, she fell gravely ill after a meal of young swan, a delicacy she rarely indulged in and never regained her vigour. On the 29th of June, 1509, Margaret Beaufort died at her lodge in Hackney, aged 66. Her passing was marked with solemn ceremonies befitting her rank. Mourners clad in black lined the streets to Westminster Abbey, where she was interred beside her son Henry VI I and her grandson, the future Henry VI II. Margaret's tomb, sculpted by Torrigiano, depicts her in prayer, draped in a widow's mantle, her face modelled on a death mask said to capture her final expression of piety. The Latin inscription lists her achievements, the colleges she founded, the scholarship she endowed, and the legal protections she secured. But above all, it names her Mater Regis, Mother of the King, a title that encapsulated her greatest legacy. Thus ends the life story of Margaret Beaufort, a woman who rose from pawn to architect of a dynasty, whose patience and maternal love rewrote England's fate. Her years of counsel, charity, and quiet resolve planted the seeds of the Tudor era. Through her final breath, she left an enduring gift, a kingdom united under her son, and a cultural heritage of learning and justice that would resonate through the ages. In the wake of the decisive victory at Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485, Margaret Beaufort's power reached its apex. No longer merely the king's mother, she became his principal political counsellor, a role unprecedented for a woman in English court. Each weighty decision, be it grants of land to noble families who had supported the Tudor claim, or adjustments to inheritance statutes to secure her son's reign, bore Margaret's subtle imprint. From the very moment Henry VII entered Westminster Abbey at his solemn coronation on the 30th of October, Margaret's hand guided the distribution of patronage. She advocated for the Montague family of Wales, whose men had rallied to Henry's cause, ensuring they received banners and baronies commensurate with their loyalty. By strengthening ties to Welsh lords, an essential pillar of Tudor legitimacy, she sought to forestall any resurgence of Yorkist uprisings in the Marches. At council meetings held in the Painted Chamber of the Palace of Westminster, her voice, measured yet authoritative, influenced the forging of alliances, the awarding of knighthoods, and the daily course of governance. Margaret also focused on diplomatic ceremonial. She presided over the reception of foreign envoys, Spanish ambassadors from the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, Flemish merchants with letters patent, and Italian princes seeking trade charters, arranging sumptuous banquets in the Great Hall at Richmond Palace. At each gathering, she emphasized Tudor magnanimity, distributing broken plate as tokens of goodwill, and affirming treaties that bound England to peace and prosperity. Simultaneously, she did not hesitate to clamp down on remaining Yorkist sympathizers. Those suspected of plotting were quietly arrested, their estates sequestered, and their houses placed under royal wardship. By balancing clemency with firmness, Margaret stabilized a realm wearied by decades of civil war. Yet it was in the realm of scholarship and piety that Margaret's legacy shone brightest. In the year 1505, she founded Christ's College, Cambridge, with a formal charter dated the 12th of July. Her endowment provided for a master, 10 fellows and 10 scholars, along with funds for liturgical robes and silver service in the college chapel. Later, through her will sealed on the 15th of December, 1509, she bequeathed lands whose revenues would establish St. John's College. Although St. John's officially received its royal charter on the 9th of April, 1511, Margaret's foresight and generosity laid its foundation well before her passing. Margaret's educational patronage extended beyond brick and mortar. She established scholarships for impoverished youths of Lancashire and Cheshire, sending dispatches in the spring of 1490 to local parish priests, instructing them to identify boys of good Christian character who might matriculate at Cambridge. She invited reputed scholars from France and Italy to lecture in Greek, Hebrew, and civil law languages, and disciplines then considered arcane in England. At her behest, the New English translation of the Psalter was printed in 1506, its pages bearing her heraldic arms in the colophon, so that devout laypeople could read scripture in their own tongue. Across Europe, news of Lady Margaret, Mother of the King, spread through merchant caravans and diplomatic letters. Chroniclers in Bruges and Paris praised her as a model woman of virtue, learning, and gentle authority, a rare combination in a patriarchal age. Yet these accolades masked a hidden sorrow, the bodily damage she had sustained in January 1457, when she nearly died giving birth to Henry, left her frail and unable to bear another child. No cradle's gentle motion tugged at her heart beyond that first fateful labour. Even as she oversaw the education of thousands, her own womb remained barren, a reminder of the price she had paid. Every morning, at the frost-kissed hour of dawn, Margaret walked the cloisters of Christ's College with her chaplain, reciting Matins prayers while the mist curled around ancient stones. Flocks of undergraduates, wrapped in scarlet gowns, passed silently before her, their faces turned to wax candles or to her warm yet knowing gaze. In her hands she carried a small vellum book of hours, its pages still stained with the ink of her youthful letters to Henry in Brittany. As she blessed each scholar, a shadow flickered across her countenance, a fleeting remembrance of battles lost and a solitary mother's tears. Thus, for nearly a quarter century, Margaret Beaufort balanced public triumph with private lament. She reformed the laws governing land and legacy to guard the Tudor realm, built walls and scholarships for future minds, and shaped policy at the heart of government. Yet behind the grandeur of her patronage lay the quiet ache of sacrifice. A body marred by childbirth, a heart yearning yet unfulfilled beyond that firstborn son. Even as her colleges flourished and the Tudor dynasty grew secure, Margaret carried forward the memory of past hardships, her legacy both of power and of the enduring cost of ambition. In the year 1509, King Henry VII's health began to fail. Court physicians whispered of blood poisoning, perhaps septicemia contracted after a hunting excursion. On the twilight of his life, Margaret Beaufort left her studies at Christ's College and hastened to Whitehall Palace. There, she kept a ceaseless vigil at her son's bedside, pacing the silent corridors by lantern light and administering simple broths herself. According to rumour retold in hushed tones at court, Margaret, ever devoted to her son's comfort, insisted he dine on a rare feast of young swan, a delicacy she believed would restore his strength. Whether the swan meat was tainted or the king's constitution too weakened to find nourishment, within days his fever worsened. Margaret never left his side, spooning broth and holding his hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. Curtains fluttered in the summer breeze, but Henry's chamber felt frozen in time, each tick of the great clock marking his dwindling breaths. On the 21st day of April, 1509, at approximately the third hour of the afternoon, King Henry VII passed away at the age of 52. The court physician recorded exhaustion and organ failure precipitated by infection. Margaret, though overcome with grief, remained composed. She closed her son's eyes with gentle care and, in the days that followed, arranged his funeral at Westminster Abbey, ensuring every detail honoured his memory and his office. Yet the Queen Mother's own spirit collapsed under the weight of her loss. For decades, Margaret's life had been defined by her son's welfare, from the perilous birth that had nearly cost her life in 1457 to the months of exile in Brittany and the long years of political intrigue. With Henry VI gone, she felt her raison d'être vanish. Letters she penned in the final week of her son's life, now preserved in the royal archive, plead for solace and speak of a heart rent asunder, a life without compass. Margaret's own health, fragile since her perilous childbirth, never recovered from the strain of her vigil. In late June, at her lodge in Hackney, she succumbed to a swift and mysterious illness. Some courtiers speculated it was a recurrence of septic fever or a collapse of her weakened constitution. On the 29th of June, 1509, Margaret Beaufort died at the age of 66. News of her passing spread quickly. Bells tolled across London, and the court fell silent in mourning for the woman who had shaped its very foundation. Her funeral at Westminster Abbey was both grand and sombre. Dignitaries in mourning black lined the nave, dukes and earls, bishops in vestments of dusk, and scholars from the colleges she founded. The service, held on the 5th of July, included a requiem mass sung by 24 clerics, their voices rising in Gregorian chant beneath vaulting arches. When the coffin was lowered into the Beaufort chantry beside Henry VI's tomb and the effigy of her grandson, the future Henry VIII, more than one mourner wept quietly. A chronicler noted, "Never had England seen such solemn tribute, for by her death the realm lost not merely a princess, but the very architect of its peace." Margaret's tomb, sculpted by Pietro Torregiano and completed shortly after her interment, portrays her recumbent in widow's garb, hands clasped in prayer. The Latin inscription extols her virtues. Regius Mater, Ecclesiae Sponsor, Ingenii Lumen, Pietatis Monumentum, Mother of the King, Bride of the Church, Light of Wisdom, Monument of Piety. Yet even as nobles left offerings of incense and wax candles, a sense of emptiness pervaded the abbey. Margaret had outlived her purpose as mother, leaving a kingdom secure but a heart forever void. In the months that followed, her colleges at Cambridge flourished under the stewardship of her executors, and her legal reforms endured in the statutes of Parliament. But none could fill the void left in the Tudor court or in the soul of England's first Queen Mother. Henry VIII, newly crowned on the 24th of June, 1509, wore mourning for his grandmother as well as for his father, and wrote in his journal, "She who bore me in adversity and guided me to triumph now rests at peace, her labours complete." Margaret Beaufort's life closed like a grand yet sorrowful sonata, notes of hardship, strategy, and maternal devotion woven into the very fabric of the English realm. In death, as in life, she stood as a testament to perseverance. From a child pawn to the architect of a dynasty, from the anguish of widowhood at 13 to the heights of power at 66, her story remains a quiet lullaby of resilience, echoing through England's annals a reminder that love and will, even in the face of ceaseless strife, can steer the course of history itself. Margaret Beaufort's impact on England extended far beyond her own life story. The two Cambridge colleges she founded, Christ's College, chartered on the 12th of July, 1505, and St. John's College, established by royal grant on the 9th of April, 1511, became premier centres of learning. Over subsequent decades, Christ produced scholars such as Sir Thomas More, who entered as a fellow in 1523 before rising to Lord Chancellor, while St. John's counts among its alumni Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who studied there in the late 15-teens before his ascent to Archbishop of York. These institutions not only educated the clerical and political elite, but also served as models for collegiate life across Europe. Margaret's philanthropy extended to the founding of charitable grammar schools and local libraries. In the years following her death, endowment income from her estates funded reading rooms in Cambridge, Oxford and London. The library at Christ's College, stocked with manuscripts and printed works, was among the first to allow non-fellows supervised access, laying groundwork for what would become the public library movement in England. Towns such as Stafford and Shrewsbury later established free lending collections, tracing their origins to bequests from the Beaufort Endowment. A pioneering advocate for vernacular scholarship, Margaret championed the printing of books in English rather than limiting texts to Latin, the language of the learned few. In 1506, she financed an early English Psalter, one of the first mass-produced volumes intended for lay devotion, so that pious middle-class families could read scripture without ecclesiastical mediation. Her support encouraged translators to render other devotional works into English, fostering literacy among merchants, artisans, and gentry alike. This movement toward accessible texts laid intellectual groundwork for later reformers and humanists. Margaret's leadership style, a rare blend of devout piety, rigorous learning, and shrewd political acumen, became a template for powerful women in early modern Europe. Her careful negotiation of authority within a male-dominated court, her patronage of education and print, and her strategic use of wealth to advance both religious and secular causes inspired subsequent queens and regents. Queen Elizabeth I, who ascended the throne in 1558, is said to have admired Margaret's combination of maternal influence and statecraft, modelling her own governance on that precedent of wise and patient counsel attributed to the earlier Queen Mother. However, beneath these grand achievements lay the quiet echo of personal sacrifice. Margaret's health, compromised since her perilous childbirth in January 1457, never fully recovered, and her inability to bear more children remained a source of private sorrow. Yet she transformed that pain into enduring social benefit. Her colleges educated thousands, her libraries supplied the spark of curiosity to countless minds, and her printed works put sacred texts into common hands. In so doing, she extended her maternal care from a single son to an entire nation. Long after her tomb was sealed in Westminster Abbey, Margaret's influence resonated in the corridors of power and the halls of learning. The Tudor dynasty she forged with her son Henry VII and her grandson Henry VIII shaped England's political and religious course for generations. Meanwhile, Christ's and St. John's colleges continued to nurture scholars whose discoveries and writings rippled across Europe. The free libraries that grew from her endowments became cornerstones of civic education, and the English-language Bibles and prayer books she sponsored paved the way for the Reformation's embrace of personal faith. In the grand tapestry of history, Margaret Beaufort stands as both the maternal architect of a new dynasty and a visionary benefactor of learning and piety. Her life story, woven from hardship, strategy, and unwavering devotion, casts a long, gentle shadow over England's intellectual and spiritual landscape. Through her colleges, her libraries, and her printed books, she transformed private ambition into public good, ensuring that her legacy would live on in the minds she helped shape and the nation she helped to unite. Margaret Beaufort's presence endures most tangibly in two extraordinary works of art, each capturing her solemn dignity and unwavering resolve. The first is her 6-foot-tall painted portrait by the Italian sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, completed circa 1508. At approximately 1.8 meters in height, it was the earliest large-scale depiction of an English woman, and remains one of the largest 16th-century portraits to survive. In the painting, Margaret stands draped in widow's black, the heavy folds of her gown pooling around her feet. A black veil covers her hair, concealing her forehead and framing the gentle lines of her face. Her hands are clasped at her heart, left over right in a gesture of prayerful devotion. Though her expression is contemplative, the firmness of her chin and the steady gaze of her grey eyes convey determination as much as piety. Torrigiano's careful modelling of her features, high cheekbones, straight nose, and slightly furrowed brow, imbues the portrait with both gravitas and intimacy, inviting viewers to witness the soul of a woman who shaped a nation. Today, this monumental portrait hangs in the Great Hall of Christ's College, Cambridge, reminding scholars of the college's founder each time they pass beneath its gaze. Legend holds that on May the 31st, the anniversary of Margaret's birth in 1443, the portrait's eyes seem to follow the celebrants as they process through the hall, a silent blessing upon the rituals held in her honour. These annual commemorations feature a choral recital of the Reformation-era English psalms she sponsored, and a reading of her last will, highlighting her enduring influence on faith and learning. Margaret's second enduring monument resides within Westminster Abbey. Her sculpted tomb in the Beaufort Chantry, completed in 1510 under Torrigiano's direction. Carved from pale limestone and marble, the effigy portrays Margaret in prayer. She lies recumbent atop her tomb chest, her hands folded before her in perpetual supplication, her widow's veil etched in delicate detail. The face of the effigy is said to be modelled on a copper death mask taken shortly after her passing on June the 29th, 1509, preserving the serenity of her final repose. Along the sides of the tomb, relief panels depict scenes from her life: her tumultuous marriage to Edmund Tudor, the birth of Henry VII, and her final days at Whitehall. Above the effigy, a Latin inscription in Gothic script names her Mater Regia and records her virtuous deeds, while below, a carved scroll reads, "Piety, wisdom, loyalty," words that sum up the qualities for which she was most revered. Margaret's legacy is also woven into the very fabric of the two Cambridge colleges she founded. At Christ's College, the chapel she endowed retains its medieval hammer-beam roof and stained glass windows, a tranquil space for morning matins and evensong. Each spring, the chapel hosts a special service on Margaret's birthday. The choir sings anthems she helped introduce to English worship, and scholars lay wreaths upon the altar in her memory. Across the river, at St. John's College, the charter granted in 1511, but the foundation stones laid through Margaret's will visitors enter through the great gate beneath a wrought iron lantern. There stands a life-size bronze statue of Margaret Beaufort, sculpted in the early 18th century, depicting her lifting one hand in blessing and the other holding an open book. Engraved at its base are the words she once spoke: "Faith without action is but a flicker in the dark." Both colleges maintain Lady Margaret scholarships, awarded annually to students of outstanding merit. These scholarships, funded by the revenues from endowments she established, support undergraduates in theology, classics, and early modern history. Recipients are invited each May to a special lecture on Tudor history, held in the rooms Margaret originally inhabited when she visited Christ's as a patron. Following the lecture, scholars process to King's Parade, Cambridge, to lay flowers at the base of a modern plaque commemorating her birth and death dates: May the 31st, 1443, and June the 29th, 1509. Beyond Cambridge, Margaret's memory persists in other lesser-known memorials. In Staffordshire, the village of Chebsey maintains a stained-glass window in Street, Chad's Church, depicting her coat of arms flanked by roses red for Lancaster, white for York, symbolising the union she forged through her son's marriage. In London's Southwark Cathedral, a small brass plaque honours her support of English translations of the Psalms, acknowledging her role in making scripture accessible to the lay faithful. Thus, through portrait, tomb, and the living traditions of her colleges, Margaret Beaufort remains ever present in England's cultural and spiritual life. Her 6-foot portrait and sculpted effigy stand as majestic reminders of a woman whose faith, intellect, and maternal devotion transcended her era. Each year on the 31st of May, and each time a candle is lit in a Cambridge chapel, or Westminster's hush falls for prayer, the legacy of Margaret Beaufort, Queen Mother, patroness, and architect of a dynasty shines softly, a guiding light for generations yet to come. As the fire's glow softens and the day's last shadows stretch across the room, let us settle into the quiet warmth of Margaret Beaufort's story one final time. Imagine her standing in the gentle hush of the chapel at Christ's College, candles flickering like distant stars along the walls, her silhouette framed by columns of pale stone and illuminated manuscripts stacked on polished oak shelves. Recall how she moved through the courts of kings and dukes with deliberate grace, her every choice shaped by a fierce love for her son and a steadfast faith in what tomorrow could bring. Now, allow the images to drift gently, as though carried on a slow breeze across the misty fields of Bosworth or down the cloistered walkways of Cambridge. Hear the soft echo of her footsteps, the hush of vellum turning in the quiet of her study, and the faint murmur of prayers whispered before a simple wooden crucifix. In this tranquil space, Margaret's ambitions and struggles fold into a single thread of purpose: to believe that even the smallest hope, tended with patience and courage, can kindle a light that outlasts any darkness. As that light dims on the horizon, remember the lessons woven through her life, how resilience in the face of loss can sow the seeds of renewal, how the gentle persistence of learning and compassion can heal a fractured realm, and how a mother's love, steadfast and unyielding, can change the course of history itself. These are the values that linger like a soft lullaby: faith that tomorrow holds promise, wisdom tempered by humility, and the quiet conviction that each of us, in our own way, can shape the world around us. Let your breathing slow as the final candle gutters, its flame wavering before it fades to a gentle glow. Feel the gentle peace that comes from knowing that though struggles may rise like storms, there is always the dawn of a new day just beyond the dark. In that hope, let your eyelids grow heavy, your thoughts drift like clouds across a calm sky, and your heart rest in the warmth of Margaret's enduring legacy. And now, in this soft, serene moment, I whisper to you: sleep well, dream gently, and when you awaken, carry with you the quiet strength of a mother's unwavering love. If you have found comfort in our story tonight, please subscribe to our channel to share in more tales of courage, compassion, and wonder. Good night. Good